Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's my pleasure, it's also my privilege to welcome you to the final session, the final plenary of this conference. It's also my pleasure and my privilege to be chairing a session where my senior colleague, also my Vice Chancellor for a short duration of time, Professor Amritavalli, is making her presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, certain details about Amritavalli have already been made known to you, and do enjoy going through some of those details. But I will tell you something else which I know about Professor Amritavalli, partly because we come from the same state, we share same languages, and most important of all of you should know that Professor Amritavalli comes from an extremely illustrious family, and you should know that her grandfather, who was known as Dr. Masti Venkatesha Iyengar, is considered the pioneer of short stories in Kannada, even to this day. Please give her a good hand. In other words, that is the kind of lineage Professor Amritavalli has behind her. All of us who are worried about language teaching, language learning, and so on and so forth, the kinds of themes we have been concerned with all through this conference, do understand that there are several points of concern for us, such as, for example, when we think of a simple act of teaching, for example, we are aware that there can be different approaches, concerns for teaching. For example, we do know that we can talk of what is very well known as a teacher-centered classroom. All of you are aware of this. In a similar manner, we are also aware of what we commonly talk of as a learner-centered classroom. But today, it's a matter of concern when we talk of what is known as a learning-centered classroom. So it's no longer just the teacher-centered or the learner-centered, but it's also a learning-centered classroom. And the focus of attention is on the learner, on what the learner does, the learner's doing. Now, a learner does things leading to a learner's autonomy. Now, autonomy would be related to the kinds of choices a learner may have. But an autonomy could also be related to what the learner does, in addition to the kind of choices the learner may have. And today, Professor Amritavalli, in her address, is focusing on learner autonomy in text choice, authenticity, length, and comprehensibility. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor Amritavalli.
Thank you very much, Raju, for that. And thank you for the applause for my grandfather, whom I like to keep well hidden. Over the last 30 to 40 years, if there's anything that has emerged as some kind of a stable point of reference in the discourse on second language learning, it seems to me that it shows that there are two sets of variables which are both invested in the learner and not in the teacher or in the classroom. One is motivation and attitude, and the other is unconscious acquisition as against overt or consciously controllable learning. Although most school learning is content learning, or even if it is principle learning as in mathematics or in the sciences, where really you want to teach the principles, these are disciplines which have been arrived at consciously and socioculturally in some sense, along with cognitively. Whereas language use, language learning remains, along with visual processing, one of the examples of automatic processing by the human brain. Now, this therefore foregrounds the learner. And if you look at it from the experiential point of view, generations of successful learners in India have been autonomous. Look at your own learning. If you reflect on it for a minute, you might find that a large part of your learning of English has been autonomous. Many of the older generations have had extensive reading habits. Some of the younger ones, I've been speaking to 30-year-olds, and they've told me about comics. I don't know whether there are very many who have learned a lot of English through visual and oral media and film. It would be interesting to find out. With the expansion of the goals of education to include all the marginalized sections of society and inclusiveness and so on, we now have in the school systems new learners. And with these learners, we find that they often conceive of learning, especially the learning of English, as an impersonal activity where they have to measure up to some standard set by some system which is not of their making. And for these learners especially, English is, as one of my colleagues has put it, this is a quote from a lady whose work I'll refer to later, the dominant standard language. And they have to learn it because it's a survival tool. These kinds of learners, when you encounter them in the classroom, lead to the kinds of questions which I've already faced. What do I do in my classroom, says the teacher, in a completely helpless way, because the learner seems to be completely passivized. And my description of them is that they are completely overawed and alienated from learning. And that is from their perspective. And from our perspective, we see them as lacking in motivation, as having the wrong attitudes. And these factors of motivation and attitude I find very interesting in respect to second language learning, because in first language learning, how is it that there is no child who is neither not motivated or has the wrong attitude? And how is it that this happens only in second language learning? This is something which has always puzzled me. So I think this is a systemic erosion of autonomy that has happened. Recognizing this problem, the lady I referred to earlier, she was a colleague of ours called Shyamala Kumardas, and she wrote an unpublished, very modest MPhil thesis. I think it was submitted in 1993, where she argued that learner autonomy in the choice of classroom texts would restore to the learner the kind of systemic, would remedy the systemic erosion of autonomy and restore to the learner the feeling that they were in control of their own learning. She pointed out that unlike extensive reading and other kinds of interventions that had been suggested for classroom, this would make autonomy a curricular given. It would put it into the classroom, and it would also allow for authenticity by connecting it to the learner's world. And she built up an argument from Paulo Freire and Ivan Illich, and she also linked it, I think some of us, she worked with some of us, so we also linked it to the then Krashen idea of I+1 as the growth zone for language in the mind. And with the older Vygotskian idea in socio-cognitive learning, that there is a zone of proximal development, which is that area which is just adjacent to the learner's inherent capacity at that point of time. If you intervene at an area which is just beyond him at that point of time, then you promote learning in the learner, to put it in a very crude paraphrase. So we thought that learner autonomy in the choice of what should be brought to the classroom as a text in the classroom would probably meet both sociocultural and cognitive ideas about learning, and especially about learning of languages. And we thought that, she especially thought that this would really work with new learners. Her work was with tertiary or college learners. Much after that MPhil was done, about 7 to 10 years later, I thought of extending that work, but this time into the school. And around that time, there was a small non-formal school for girls who worked as domestic labor and also who were children of construction workers, I think. The principal of that school expressed her difficulties to me. She said, I can teach them everything, but English is very difficult. This was a very committed lady who had worked in some of the best schools in Mumbai, for example, and she had a very progressive view of education. This was a school where some of the best principles of education were put into practice, and she was very unhappy about the level of English and how to teach English in this small school. Now, in this kind of school, the school ran between 2 p.m. and 5 p.m. every day, because the girls were domestic help in the mornings, and after 5, either they went back for an hour of work or they went back to their families, and there was work at home to be done. So there were obvious limitations in the amount of time we had for teaching anything. For English, my intervention was limited to 1 hour a week. There was also the problem of learner mobility, especially those who were construction workers' children. You know that we have construction workers in India who move every 6 months, maybe, or maybe even 3 months. So it was imperative that any intervention here would be not in the form of content transmission, but in enabling the learner to learn, so that the takeaway from this situation would remain with the child. Where possible, the school did try to mainstream the children in 2 ways, putting them up to the 7th class examination in the Andhra Pradesh board, or putting them into those days the residential school system had just started, and sometimes allowing them to go through 10th class also. But we had all kinds of learners in that school. Now, as far as my own research agenda was concerned, I thought I would get an insight into what this ZPD, or the I+1, was by working with these learners, because neither Krashen nor Vygotsky had been able to put any content into it. And obviously, this is a very individual thing for each learner. The I is the stage of learning that I am at now, and the +1 is the next proximal stage, and that's all we've ever been able to say about it. So I was wondering whether we could arrive at some kind of a learning map by looking at how these learners progressed. And as I later realized, studying the paths taken by the individual learners in text choice would help us to understand these notions. This is the premise that I later developed. Okay, so in the school, I ultimately interacted with 15 learners. Later on, the same principles that I'm talking about today, I implemented with a group of international adult learners of 30 or 35 in our institution. But today, for this presentation, I'll talk about a group of 3 learners in the school. This is the 3 learners whom the teacher had, the principal had identified as otherwise ready to take the class 7 examination for the next year. You know, looking at all the subject knowledge and so on, she was saying, these people, if we can manage to make them take the class 7 examination, then they could be mainstreamed. They could be put into the local schools. So the problem was English teaching. And I started the intervention sometime at the end of the previous year, so March, April. and going to the classroom with all my ideas about, learner autonomy, authenticity, and so on, I decided that the 1 hour a week I had with them would be spent divided between half an hour of teaching the textbook and half an hour of getting them to read something. Because I thought that the one skill that could be given to them could be reading. Since these were extremely poor people, any video or television they watched was incidental. So I thought if they could continue to read in English, they would have something to take away. And so the materials I took to class were newspapers, stories, which I thought were either age appropriate or language appropriate, simple stories, reading cards from science projects, and of course, packaging. So we did about 6 weeks or 8 weeks of this, March, April, and then we closed for the summer. And the next year, the principal was very unhappy because we administered a class examination. At the end of that academic year, these students were supposed to take the 7th class examination. So we did some kind of teaching and had an examination, and there wasn't much that we could be proud about. And it was obvious that the reading ability of these children was not up to the prose lessons in that textbook, which were on topics like fingerprints, hovercraft, and crocodiles. Okay? So this gap between the syllabus expectations and the learner abilities is so typical of our classrooms. And that's what I think leads to play acting at learning and teaching in the classrooms, and it also leads to rote learning. So to just give you an idea of the kind of reading these 3 children, they were about 14 to 16-year-old, I think. They were a little older than the typical profile. So I've got the dates there. This is a project that I did between 98 and 99. So from the newspaper material that I took to class, you can see that one of them, luckily they're not reading alphabet. They're reading words. They're reading phrases. So they're reading things like get up, get out. But they're reading anything at all. You can see that they're reading names like A. Shekhar, which was the name of a person who had written that particular article. This was mainly newspaper supplements meant for children, which would have the byline of the author in them. They're reading slogans, they're reading headings, like the Saturday morning show. The second child there was the one that especially the principal wanted to concentrate on and send her up to the 7th class. And you can see that she's also just reading phrases out of the mouths of babes, summer flowering trees, if all goes well. And there's no real reading going on at all. So these are well-known problems in reading, and they were, attested in this classroom. The learners did not seem to be sufficiently engaged with the language. They did not appear to struggle to make meaning. Even the little teaching that I was doing for half an hour a week, I could see that they had learned the content of what the lesson said, but they recalled very little of the language. When you asked them to read, there was an emphasis on accuracy, and that had paralyzed their reading. And in fact, that emphasis on accuracy could have been promoted by their academic achievement in the other subjects in that class, because they were good at math, they were good at physics, and you have to be accurate in these subjects. So if you bring the same strategy to language learning, then you want to be accurate. And so they were reading aloud very slowly, word by word, rather than in sense groups. And as I've already pointed out, there was no attempt to look at a text at all. And that's what really stumped me, because I thought I had taken what I thought was quite appropriate, age-appropriate material into the class. So with the new academic year and that, the first semester exam, this was October or sometime, I got into a dilemma, because the principal said, well, these children have to pass their 7th class, and if they don't pass in English, what do we do? So I knew that I couldn't go on with their reading newspapers. It seemed to be such a waste of the 1 hour we had a week. And on the other hand, if I taught the textbook as I had tried to do, I had actually covered, in my view, in a very efficient and dedicated manner, 2 entire lessons in that textbook. And that had been an utter waste of time as far as I could see. So having got into this wonderful muddle, then I decided in the subsequent class, I said, okay, this is the 3rd lesson, and I've already tried to read out the first 2 paragraphs to you in the last class. Now you make sense of the 3rd paragraph, and I'm not going to help. So they struggled, and we covered 1 paragraph in 1 hour. And at the end of it, the children, you should have seen their faces. They were sullen and rebellious. And I was, as I told you, I was completely at my wit's end. I didn't want to go back next week. So the next week when I went back, I went back to teaching for half an hour. And then suddenly, out of the blue, I thought of saying, find something that you want to read from the textbook. And then they started to leaf through the textbook. And they came up with texts. I'll show you the texts. In that half an hour then, they collectively covered 3 times as much print as I had taught in the previous half hour. And these are children, you remember the previous hour, they had struggled with 1 paragraph of that lesson on crocodiles. And they had already started to, show skills of skimming and scanning because they all went through the textbook because there was a lot of page turning and so on going on. So this is the first time I realized that there could be some idea of choosing your own text from within the textbook. The idea of a self-chosen text does not have to go outside the set course book. So look, I don't know if this is readable. Yeah. So you can see that this is what is given in the textbook as speaking. This was quite a nice textbook in that way from the Andhra Pradesh government. They did have sections like this. So you can see this is Rama, this is his daily routine, and this was read out very competently by that child, and she had understood what it meant. Every morning, Rama wakes up at 7 o'clock, he gets out of bed, he washes his face, he brushes his teeth, he eats his breakfast, etc., etc. So this was, you can see that's already about a paragraph that's been read. The second child chooses this poem. I think she read only the first verse of that poem. I wonder why the grass is green and why the wind is never seen, who taught the birds to build a nest and told the trees to take a rest. And she had more or less understood what she was reading. And the third child chose this one. How do you like to go up in a swing, up in the air so blue? Oh, I do think it, the pleasantest thing ever a child can do. So you can see then that suddenly the quantum of reading has jumped to 3 times what they have done earlier on their own. And you can see that now they're reading entire texts. The same children who, when faced with the so-called material that I had taken into the classroom, were reading only phrases. So I realized that the question that I had finally stumbled upon was, what is authentic for these learners? What did they perceive as learning English? And obviously, they didn't perceive reading newspapers as learning English. And I also realized that, cartons, these were not products they ever used, like toothpastes. I once asked them, there was a lot of English in the signboards in the locality. This is a school near where I work. And there's a lot of English signboards. They had not bothered to look at any of those signboards because they weren't going into those shops to buy things. So these were learners whose mornings were spent as domestic helps and the evenings were spent helping their families. They're sparing 3 hours a day from these lives to come to school in order to pass an examination. So reading for the sake of reading, for them, did not make any sense at all. Whereas they could make that choice from within the textbook, because the textbook was something they thought they had to read anyway. It met their perception of what the goals of coming to the school were, and it did not go so far away from their immediate capacity as to lose all meaning for them. So for these children then, to read what they wanted to read from within the textbook was the most authentic task. And at this point, I must recall a quotation which has already been discussed in this conference. I don't quite recall who said this, but I mean, who did this in this conference. But Widdowson has made this distinction between genuine and authentic. And genuine, all real occurring language, all corpus-based material is not necessarily authentic, because authenticity is not a quality which resides in instances of language, but a quality which is bestowed on these instances of language, created by the response of the receiver. So what you want to read is what is authentic for you. And therefore, learner-chosen instructional materials are authentic when they result from a response from the receiver right at the beginning. I think I have about 15 minutes more. Yeah, okay. So, this distinction between authenticity and genuineness came real for me in this classroom. I'd like to spend the next 15 minutes talking a little bit about the kinds of texts that these learners chose, because after this, the rest of that school year, well, not all of it, but because some, I think I taught from, say, October to January using this method, was spent by my teaching the prose lessons for half an hour, and the learners picking up from the textbook what they wanted to read for the other half hour. And remember, this was 1 hour a week. Finally, that lady did pass the 7th class exam. I can tell you that good news. Okay. Okay. So so at the end, I put together all the material that the children had chosen to read by themselves, and then I realized, first of all, the early choice of poetry, as I have already shown you. Notice that as a teacher of English, I had avoided doing the poems. Honestly, I didn't have a clue, because poems, do you remember the language of those poems? I mean, how do you teach something like, up in the air so blue? How do you teach something like, I do think it is the pleasantest thing ever a child can do? These look quite complicated to you, don't they? So if you want to teach vocabulary and structure and grammar and so on, these are very difficult things to do. Okay, look at this one. I wonder why the grass is green. Who taught the birds to build a nest? These are complicated structures. The indirect questions, there are, things like this. So I had obviously not thought of teaching the poems at all, but the children had chosen them, and they had made some sense of them. That was the funniest thing. And it had so many nice features. When they read these things aloud in the classroom, when they read the other text on crocodiles, as I told you, it was word-by-word reading. There was no sense of a text. These things, when they read them out, there was a natural rhythm that came out even in their reading, okay? And when they asked me what something meant, if it was a reading passage, you would stumble on individual words. But in these kinds of texts, they would read the entire thing and say, okay, does this mean this? Up in the air so blue, what does it mean? And they would have got a kind of global understanding of what it meant. They did not get hung up on individual words and individual meaning. And later, when I looked at Hall and Coles' work in the inner cities in Britain on what children were reading, I found a very similar experience in the first language situation. Let me just read this out to you if I can. Not only is poetry reading more popular amongst younger children, and these are British children they're talking about, but also children from lower socioeconomic groups are proportionately more likely to be reading it. One explanation for the appeal of poetry to younger children might relate to the fact that poems stand as discrete, short texts which can be encompassed by a younger child or weaker reader in one reading. And this seems to me to have summed up what kind of texts these learners chose. You have to encompass the text in one reading, and you are getting a text, so you're getting some meaning as a takeaway. And both Hall and Coles and the earlier survey by Whitehead and my own experience shows that learner-chosen texts can be quite diverse when they exercise their choice. Let me show you what the first bullet point there is looking at what kinds of texts one learner chose. And I looked at the length of the text in terms of words, and I looked at the number of sentences, which gave me an idea of whether these sentences were long or short. So I've just put those up. And you can see that these are texts between, say, 60 to 83 words or 100 words, and there are 10 sentences. So they are short sentences as well. And then what are the things that they read? These are all in the textbook. One was called The Wonderful World, one was called Ramamurthy and Family, then there was a letter. I remember Kindness to Animals was a story about Raman Maharshi's feeding a squirrel. And there were texts under doing things and under speaking and so on. So then when I looked, I put all these sheets of paper together, and I found that every selection by the child had been either a dialogue or it had had pictures. I've already shown you the kinds of texts. This was a government textbook. It's all black and white line drawings. But there are parts of the reading parts of the texts, the lessons in the texts don't even have those drawings. Whereas these are the other parts of the texts. And so it was as if a hidden textbook had emerged, as if a picture book had emerged from that textbook. And this was a children's book and not a textbook. Okay, so much about the length and the kinds of texts. And then the issue of comprehensibility. Now, comprehensibility, when I looked at the texts, as I've already suggested to you, these texts were not a priori simpler in some sense of simplified language. Let me show you another text. This was by a slightly older learner who had passed his 10th class, and I had given him, Please Believe It or Not, to take home over a week and look. And I said, come back, finding something that you have read. And you can see that he has chosen this very nice story about a British War Secretary and Lord High Chancellor who wrote a letter to his mother every day for 48 years, beginning with the year 1877 when his father died and continuing until May 1925 when his mother passed on at the age of 106 years and 6 weeks. Lord Haldane never missed writing to her a single day. And you can see the appeal that this text would have in the Indian context, right? It goes right to our emotional center. Now, just look at what was left out by this student was at least 18 or 19 years old, I think, because he had finished his 10th class, he had got admission into an engineering polytechnic degree. Just look at how the text continues, and the student omitted that. This statesman and philosopher is the only British cabinet member who was simultaneously a member of the German cabinet for one day. The appointment was made by Kaiser Wilhelm II to enable Haldane to take part in one meeting of the German cabinet of ministers. This guy just simply ignored it. And then when I looked at it, I thought a good materials producer would have done exactly what the student did on his own. He took that part of the text which was relevant to him, which touched an emotional chord, and he understood it, and he was happy, and the rest of the text he ignored. And I thought this was a wonderful thing that the children were doing. So then I went back to Prabhu, and Prabhu has made the statement that comprehensibility is not inherent to a text. It means not just the quality of the text or the ability of the learner. It is an ability to leave open what does not make immediate sense if it is not judged relevant to your own purposes. And if you look back at how you read, or if you look back at how you've been listening to us, all of us in these conferences, you will realize that you have never bothered to comprehend every single thing that was said. You have taken in as much as you can take in, and you have switched off. And that is how I think all of us learn. So this is the quotation from Prabhu. The same sample of language can be comprehensible to the same learner at one level, and for one purpose, and incomprehensible at another. Teaching is therefore primarily a matter of regulating the level of comprehension needed. Well, but in this case, I'm not talking about teaching so much as the learner's ability to regulate his own comprehension. So this I+1, you've got some idea now of where I+1 resides, because in a formal teaching situation, you all know this, we ask comprehension questions. What is the intention of those comprehension questions? That learners should focus on meaning and understand the text. But in reality, what happens? You dictate the answers. And the whole thing is reduced to a farce. And we have, we talk about it we moralize about this, right? Why do you do this? And the teacher should not do this, and so on. But that will happen because the level of comprehension is being set by the teacher or by the textbook writer. It's not the level of comprehension that the learner is setting for himself. And therefore, anything that you do in that formal situation will have to be simply rote learnt. Okay, so it gives us insights into why our classrooms are becoming the kinds of spaces that we all know they are. And the whole thing is due to the erosion of learner autonomy, and at that point I will wind up, and thank you.
Thanks, Amrit. It opens up a new possibility of considering not just classroom teaching, but perhaps inclusive ideas such as focusing on the learner's needs and producing text materials which go with the learner's ability to comprehend and probably enjoy learning. It introduces us to a very unique experiment, a very special tryout. But if we are able to extend the kind of ideas that Professor Amritavalli has talked about today, it is possible perhaps to think of a very large number of our learner population, not just in India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Sri Lanka. It could be in Yemen, it could be in Afghanistan, it could even be in South Africa, wherein if we take into consideration a situation where we want the learners to read, comprehend, interact, and react to the kind of prescribed texts. Could be that that's one type of experience which is a kind of a top-down kind of an event. Whereas, on the other hand, if we for a moment think of a situation where we take into consideration the learner's abilities to read, to interact with the text, and perhaps the kind of subtexts that a learner might create in the process of reading and interaction, it would then be possible for us to see that there may be an argument which says that why not create texts with subtexts which are generated by the learner perhaps, or generated in such a manner that we keep the learner's interests in mind. This is the kind of possibility, in my view, which Professor Amritavalli has generated. The presentation is now open for questions and answers. I'm giving you 10 seconds to get ready with your questions. Don't put up the hand just like that and then start thinking of the question. I'm giving you a few seconds to sort of get ready with the questions. And if you want, please check with your neighbors what questions you want to ask. Fine. Much better. I will begin from the last rows. Since there are no hands at all at the last rows, I'm ignoring them. And I'm beginning with the gentleman right there. Yes, please stand up and then ask your question. You're ready with your question? Yeah.
Ma'am, thank you very much for the presentation and giving the examples from the earlier textbook. Now, we can proudly say, due to the curriculum revision, we have taken care of the learner's autonomy in the new textbooks. And here, unlike the other things, now the textbook writers are the practitioners, the teachers working at grassroots level. And with this, we try to cover the learner's needs in particular, and we are using the textbooks. But the ground reality is there is a lot of resistance.
To what?
How to digest the materials from the teachers in large.
Yeah, which textbooks are you talking about?
I'm just talking about class 7,
Andhra Pradesh.
AP textbook, now which is in use.
So have you ever tried asking the learners whether there's anything in the book that they like?
Yeah, as far as the children are concerned, okay, the physical features and the treatment, the thematic approach, everything is fine.
No, I'm not talking about treatment and children aren't usually aware of treatment and approach. Is there anything in that book that they like to read or think about?
Yeah, actually, the books are designed on the lines of thematic approach.
So I think what I'm trying to say is, why don't we start with that? Because what I forgot to say was that after that, when we went to another group and did the same thing, the learners started to read. You know, I told you once about how they struggled with one paragraph of crocodiles.
Okay.
The second group I worked with were able to deal with 4 or 5 paragraphs. Once they had gone through this kind of learning to read on their own and making sense of a text. So once they get hold of what they can do with the text, they seem to be able to go forward. Right. Now, what I'm interested in is, this is a very small and a very personal experience, and I'm wondering whether it is generalizable, and that's why I'm asking you these questions. So I would suggest that you could try to do this with that text.
That's all right. Yeah. Probably you should be able to try out at your level and come back with the... Yes, sir.
Thank you, sir. I'm very much convinced about the learner autonomy of choosing the text, but could you suggest me how do we apply it in our classroom situation in the present scenario of a fixed framework of syllabus and assessment?
But I was also working with a fixed framework of syllabus and assessment. The only thing is, I think we were working with a smaller group, but then I was working 1 hour a week. So I would be interested, I can't tell you, I would be interested if you try it out and tell me where it cannot be generalized and where it can generalize. I think this is for us all to think about, because there's nothing I can tell you about this.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of scope for your own experiment and so on. Sir, here. Yeah, in pink shirt.
Good evening, sir. The question is with you, for you, sir. You have, yes, sir. Raju, sir. No, sir. The question is for you.
Yes, let's.
I know you personally, sir. You are such a humorous person, and
Question.
Sir, I know, sir, what is the teacher-centered classroom. I now knowing that what is learner-centered classroom, but you have just spoken about a term that is learning-centered education. Would you mind please explaining a bit?
Nothing at all. What Professor Amritavalli has done is focusing on not the teacher, not just the learner, but what the learner takes in at the end of a learning session. In a learning classroom, learning-centered classroom, the teacher is always interested in how much a learner has learned, how well the learner has learned, and what are the factors which have aided in that learning. That is learning-centered classroom. That's what Professor Amritavalli has tried to focus on. That's why I brought in that
And I
issue.
think you've done an excellent job in a conference because you've made the chair answer a question.
This was a very special one. Uma. Uma.
Professor Amritavalli, you spoke about learner autonomy and the study that you had made, the experiment you had made, and the success was inspiring, which can be replicated by the teachers over here. However, I have a question to ask you. You talked about erosion of learner autonomy, and I would like to draw your attention to what's happening in the Central Board of Secondary Education, the schools which come under the board. As you know, the continuous and comprehensive evaluation has been introduced, and the portions or the syllabus to be covered is split between the lessons or the units to be covered in the first term, followed by those to be done in the second term, and you have the formative assessments and the summative assessments. Are you aware that publishers have started splitting the textbooks into quarter, half, and children don't even get the whole of the text.
Into semesters, in fact.
Semesters. Yeah. Children don't even see the face of a complete textbook. So where is the teacher's autonomy, leave alone the learner autonomy playing in this scenario? Thank you.
Ma'am, Uma, I think I know the system in some measure after working with NCF, because as soon as my textbooks were out, the guidebooks were out, and I went and bought them. So, so I have no answers. I'm only saying there was a situation in which I'm sharing with you a particular set of answers that I worked out in my situation. That's all. And I'm sharing this with you here today because I would like to know from the people on the ground whether this is in any way generalizable, even given all your problems. Let me remind you, I can only remind you that I worked 1 hour a week. You work 5 hours a week. Can you set 1 hour a week or half an hour every day or, something like that apart? I don't know. You will see the results, I think, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, remember, Uma, hello. What Amrit says has nothing to do with CBSE, ICSE or State Board. Certainly not. True. No. You have to look at it from a slightly different perspective, which is there is a philosophy underlying the presentation. The philosophy tries to take you on to a notion, a situation where you're taking into consideration what the learner can do, given an opportunity. It doesn't require a CBSE, ICSE syllabus at all. That's the whole thing. So take it in. If you approve of the philosophy, apply it and try and see. Just a minute. Yeah. There's a question there.
In the selection of the textbook, ma'am, if the students are given the autonomy of selecting their own text, do you think that it will serve the purpose? Because in the selection of textbooks, several factors are taken into consideration that regarding suitability of the text for cognitive development, aesthetic development, cultural development, so on and so forth. So will the children be able to make such selection which will serve? Second, one more thing I would like to add, that don't you think that the text should be a bit challenging so that they will have the pleasure of discovery, the discovery of meaning in the text? Because if the students have the autonomy of selection of textbooks, they will go for easier text.
We get the question.
I get your question. I think the first thing to point out is that when we are talking about texts, I'm talking about from within the textbook, a text, a discourse. Is that clear? I'm not talking about where, in fact, the learner was unable to select his own texts when I took in the newspapers, okay? Young World and so on, okay? So I'm not talking about texts outside the textbook. I'm taking for granted the prescribed in its own wisdom, I'm sure, very well thought out, very well conceived, government Andhra Pradesh textbook, okay? So there is no dispute over there at all. Secondly, about the level of choice, level of challenge, that is what the I+1 or the ZPD or whatever was supposed to be. Because I think if you have your own children or if you know any children, you will realize that children are naturally competitive. They love to challenge themselves. Maybe as adults, we don't. I know that if I can get very personal with you, I got me a new mixer grinder and I put it away for 6 months because it had all the wrong buttons and I had no idea how to use it. But have you ever seen a child put away something like that? Children constantly challenge themselves. They play games with each other to find out who is better than the other one. Children have a natural urge to learn. So the challenge doesn't have to be set by you. Today, if you challenge me to jump off the stage, I will not do it. I'm sorry, I cannot jump off the stage because it's beyond my I+1.
Yeah.
I would have to just a small clarification about, would you please highlight upon the term encompassable
Encompassable text,
Yes.
yeah.
And what according to you that decides a good text?
What according to me decides a good text?
Good textbook.
Good textbook?
Yeah,
No,
textbook
nothing.
total.
I have nothing. I have said nothing about a good textbook.
Not
Absolutely
according to
nothing
you.
at all.
Yeah.
I have no idea. I am the worst when it comes to these things. I have no idea what a good textbook is like.
Okay,
All
encompassable text.
all that I have tried to say is that each child is the judge, the best judge of what that child can do and what the child would like to do. And I've also tried to say that what the child would like to do, as long as that child is still growing mentally or physically, is always a little beyond what the child already can do. Each child has got that ability. That's the first thing. Encompassable text. What I'm trying to ask, keep a diary starting today, please, about what you read each day. You will find that you read short texts, you read complete texts, and you read them at one sitting, right? Today, if you walk out of this place and you find a newspaper, you'll read an article in it or a news item in it, which you find interesting. But what do we do in the classrooms? Children, today I'm going to teach you about crocodiles. Tomorrow, children, I will teach you the 3rd paragraph of crocodiles. The day after, children, I will teach you the 7th paragraph of crocodiles. So somehow, Uma just talked about people cutting up syllabi. You also do the opposite, where you stretch one text across a week. Somehow, a good textbook in India, at least, I don't know about the world, but in India, usually has 12 lessons in it. Is that right? For some reason.
Yeah.
Yes.
Just a
For some reason, it has 10 or 12 lessons in it. And that means I must spend 1 month on each lesson. Or I don't know what the idea is. But these are the things I'm challenging. Because when you do this kind of autonomy, I didn't have time to tell you everything, but I've written about it. And you find that the amount of reading goes up. The same child comes back to a more challenging text and is able to cope with it much easier. And there are many diverse kinds of texts which are brought in and shared in a classroom. All right? So it's a very different kind of activity. It changes the classroom. That's all I wanted to say.
Yeah.
I really think,
Sorry?
Nina had a question.
Just a minute. Yeah, just a minute. I'll come back to you.
Professor Amritavalli, I fully sort of agree with you when you talked about the students, you asked them to choose their own texts and they immediately, sort of got busy in the task and they turned the pages of the book and they came up with, texts which they wanted to read and they read 3 times. We have done similar experiments and we thought they were very, very successful experiments when you allow children to read what they want to read. I teach at Guwahati University, and one of my research scholars is doing research on reading, and she's done experiments, and they have really been very successful. So I'm happy about that. My question to you is about the time which you gave to the control group, once a week. Do you think that could also have been the cause of, the group not really growing? Because learners in the beginning, once a week, you said 1 hour a week when you gave to these children, there is a lot of regression. They need to be interacting with the language, more frequently.
Madam,
So do you think
there was only one group. There was only one school. And the time given once a week was because that was the amount of time I could spare. Okay? Not only that, these were children who were at school 3 hours a day. I don't know how long your normal school is. Is it 5 hours? Okay? So a little longer than 5 hours. So these are children who've got only half a day at school because they're working. And both the principal and the children needed to spend much more time on the content subjects like math and physics and God knows what else you need to do. So, and they were also doing Hindi and Telugu, I think, if I'm not mistaken. So the time was dictated by what is feasible in that situation, constraints of both my time and their time.
Yeah, I understand the constraint. I just wondered that if it was possible to give more time, then the results might have been better. It's just, sort of.
Okay, all right. We are almost run out of time. Yeah, yes, okay, ask.
Yes.
Ma'am, my question is, from the side of a learner, when a child answers a question, finally is assessed, and the teacher says, okay, he's very good, he gets A1, but in the score he gets a 9.5, and as a mother I asked her, why a 9.5? And she said, you don't give full marks for English. So my question to her was, is he is he well versed for his level as a 4th grader? As a 10-year-old, is he good? Then why not? So my question to you is, why the English teachers say we don't give full marks for English? What is the level of evaluating a child for English for the age and for the grade, but somehow they don't want to give it all?
Ma'am, can I say that you've asked me a question which is really outside my competence, because honestly, there are much better people who here who can answer your question. But I think if I may share with you the very limited thinking I have on this subject, what I understood from Professor Jacob Taro long ago was this. In subjects like arithmetic, where you know whether 4 plus 5 is equal to 9 or not, you can give 99 out of 100, you can give 99 and a half, 99 and 3/4 out of 100. In subjects like composition, are you able to make 100 points of discrimination or not? And it turns out that most of us, for example, try to grade the sessions in this conference. Try to grade the speakers. My guess is you will probably be able to come up with 3 or 4 grades. I loved that talk. Oh, I hated this talk. This was useful. Nothing new. So in subjects like this, I understand, you make broad judgments, and that is why today we have moved away from marks to grades. Unfortunately, we have gone the other way, and we've moved away from marks to grades in the sciences and the mathematics, which never made any sense to me. But my answer to your question is, in a language in a language paper like English, if my child got 10 on 10, I would assume that was on spelling and on nothing else.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for this wonderful session, for your wonderful response. Thanks a lot.